Hey guys, today we're continuing our inquiry on how did the English survive in the North Sea world up to 1066. And we can see on this map, which depicts England in 879, about what England looked like in the 9th century and how it was struggling in its survival in the North Sea world. You can see quite clearly there's a whole chunk of England, nearly 50% of what is now England, was under something called Dane law. So Dane law is a historical name given to the part of England in which the laws of the Danes ruled over the Anglo-Saxons, which essentially means that the English in those territories didn't have the power to govern themselves. Their laws were made by Vikings, by their Danish rulers. So this was a direct consequence of the invasion of the Great Heathen Army, which saw the Vikings having stronger control on what we would now call England. So the Viking army was led by Guthrum, and they marched on and they conquered Mercia in 874, leaving Wessex as the last standing Anglo-Saxon kingdom. But as you can see with the provenance of the map, as well as the outlying territories, the expansion was halted. You could see that after the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum in 879, that there is very clearly a Danish territory or a Viking territory and an English territory. How did this happen? How was this mighty invasion force forced into surrender? So we could see in the map that it would be ahistorical to talk of England as anything other than a geographical term. It was not a united political community. It had no state with one clear leader. There was no English king. There was no English monarch or English sovereign. So although the people had a common ethnic heritage and language, they saw themselves as members of their regions and not one nation. However, the combination of a common enemy and skilled diplomacy led to the forging of a powerful English alliance between Mercia and Wessex. The foundations of the connections between Wessex and Mercia were laid in 868 with the marriage of Ælfswith of Mercia and Alfred of Wessex, a political alliance which, in the face of Viking expansion, led to the combining of those two armies, and as a result, a decisive Anglo-Saxon victory at Edington in 878, which resulted in the treaty between Guthrum, the Viking leader, and Alfred, the leader of Wessex, being signed, which allowed for Viking rule to still be part of a sizable part of England, but not over all of England. Wessex still remained the only kingdom never conquered by the Vikings, and Mercia was given back its territory. But what was the key to this success? And we've seen the name Alfred quite a lot. Who is he? Who is Alfred? And how did he manage to connect the Mercians to the kingdom of Wessex? What was it that Alfred did, and why was he so significant? So our lesson question for today is, how far did the Danes unite the English? And we're considering the extent to which the Danes or Vikings united the English, considering what we've just learned, which led to the unification of the two English territories. So what I want you to do is I just want you to pause the video and answer the question, how did the Danes unite the English, and answer it in full sentences in your book. What we need to consider then is, who was Alfred the Great, and what was his role in uniting the English? Was it him who united the English, or was it just the perfect combination of a common enemy and him being the last standing king of England? So he's actually the only English king who is of English birth to be given the title, Alfred the Great. So if we're thinking about that, the fact that his name is Alfred the Great, that there are also several statues of Alfred, not just in England, but also in America, and the fact that Henry VI even attempted to canonize him, which means to make him into a saint, in 1441. This suggests that he's a very significant figure, and he was actually in 886 claimed to be the sovereign lord of all English people, the first ever king of all the English. However, as we saw in the map earlier, he actually never was king of every single English person because he didn't rule over the whole of England. But the power in Alfred was the conception of the idea of England, the thought of the idea of England, that somebody from Wessex is the same as somebody from Northumbria, somebody from Mercia, and so forth. And he's a really hailed figure in English history. And we can see actually in this statue here, which essentially was put up in Wantage, which is an inscription about the significance of Alfred the Great in English history. It's a really interesting statue too, because you can see he's got an axe there, but also in his left hand he has a scroll. So not only was he a warrior king, he was a scholar too, somebody who prided himself on being a learned man or being an educated man. And what does this inscription then say about Alfred the Great? And what can this tell us about how did he actually manage to unite the English? So it said, Alfred found learning dead and he restored it, education neglected and he revived it, the law powerless and he gave them force, the church debased and he raised it, the land ravaged by a fearful enemy from which he delivered it. Alfred's name will live as long as mankind shall respect the past. And there's 4 key things here that are mentioned. You've got education, you've got laws, you've got church, and also land ravaged, so defending a land from an enemy. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore these 4 different areas and think, what was Alfred's impact on England and how did he help England to unite against the Danes, rather than the Danes being the reason why the English were brought together. So firstly then, Alfred found learning dead. So what does this mean? What is actually the history of England and education? So an early beginnings of education in England was in Roman Britain, from 43 AD to 410. And one of the things that the Romans brought with them were private schools. So private schools which were intended to educate the sort of more wealthy Romans, but also the beginnings of an English elite, an elite able to look after themselves. So it was essentially a place where children would go and they would learn the greats of the Roman Empire, the scientific discoveries of the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Egyptian Empire as well, and essentially be ready to take control of England. But if we're thinking about what its main focus was, its focus was actually to make English people Roman. So to turn English people, English citizens, into Roman citizens instead. So it's a place where they learnt to become Roman. But when the Roman Empire fell, so too did this educational system, and many of the things were destroyed after the Roman Empire collapsed. So the great aqueducts were destroyed, the Roman baths and really fantastic public health things which were created by the Romans were destroyed once the Romans had left. And the other thing that fell was also education. But education did return in England, and that was in 597 with St. Augustine. So St. Augustine came to England and his mission was to educate the English in Christianity. He wanted to essentially get rid of the paganism in England and convert the heathen English into Christian values. One of the ways in which he did this was to create church schools. So for every church that was built, a school was built which accompanied it. And the whole point of those schools was to reignite the torch of learning, to convert the heathen English into practicing Christians. So one of the things that they did was they taught Latin because the church services were in Latin. And the purpose of that was to essentially educate people to participate in worship, to be attached to churches and have an understanding of churches. However, just like the Roman Empire, these church schools and the power of the church did also collapse. It collapsed as the Vikings started to invade England more and more. And as we saw in the previous lesson, this was because churches had a lot of gold and they weren't very well defended. So they were an easy target then for Vikings to come and invade and raid. So what I want you to do now is to pause the clip again and answer the 2 questions, question 2 and question 3 on this slide. So why was learning dead in England? And what was the main focus of education in England before Alfred? Those 2 educational systems collapsed partially because they weren't really catered towards English people, right? And we see with Alfred the Great, we see a new establishment and a resurrection or a revival, as the inscription says, of education in this country. And what it was focused on was creating strong community centres of learning, about making it so that more people could read, more people could write. And it's not just about educating the elites, they also started to educate young, unfortunately, just boys of promise, and not just rich people, but poor people too, so that more people had access to this education and could be participants in society. So one of the things that's quite interesting is his focus was not just about essentially the spreading of Christianity, although Christianity was very much at the focus of what Alfred believed in. He did also have the priests and the monks to be the main educators as well as the nuns. But it's about actually, rather than making England English with Christianity, it's about making sure that it's part of that. Christianity is part of schooling, but not the sole focus of it. It's also about creating a common culture, a common identity, based on really important values of being educated, of being intelligent. So one of the things to make it more accessible to ordinary people was making sure that biblical texts weren't just in Latin. They were also making sure that they translated them to Anglo-Saxon, to the vernacular, the common language spoken by people in England. This was actually really successful, but in the 12th century, it was returned to Latin. Latin became the dominant language again by the Normans. I want you to think then, how did Alfred revive education? And just pause the clip and write down an answer to that question in full sentences. So another important aspect which is mentioned in the inscription is the fact that the laws which were powerless were given force by Alfred. So why is actually law important to a country? And we've just come through something quite interesting since 2016. And that was because the people in Britain voted to leave the European Union. And one of the reasons was to do with sovereignty and the idea that it was wrong to be part of Europe because Britain lost the power to make its own laws. Now, obviously, this is a political fallacy. It's not true. Britain has always had the power to make its own laws, as proven by the fact that Britain was able to leave the EU. But to people who didn't have a strong grasp of this, the idea that a foreign entity was making its own laws was something that was unpalatable, something that which could not be tolerated. So making laws is important to a country because it means that you are in charge of that country if you are making your own laws. And it's so important to identity, just as education is important to identity too. And one of the things that Alfred did is using his intellect, using his intelligence, he was able to create English laws. And in 893, he created something called the Doom Book. Doom essentially is an old English word and it just means judgment or law. It doesn't necessarily mean that you were doomed. And its idea is that it's the foundation of an English idea that nobody is above the law. And actually we see this coming into practice again much later throughout this course. So the idea that nobody's above the law, and this is a quote from the text. So doom, so judge very evenly. Do not doom one doom to the rich and another to the poor, nor doom one doom to your friend and another to your foe. So essentially the law is blind and the law will judge all people fairly. This was a principle set out in Alfred's laws, and it's a very clear deviation from Dane law. It's a deviation from the fact that British laws were decided by Vikings. Instead, they are being decided and defined by English people. So I'll give you a few more minutes just to write an answer to those two questions on the slide then, question 5 and 6. A further important aspect about Alfred was Alfred's strong connections to Christianity. So when he was actually a boy, he spent some time in Rome and he actually appealed to the Pope at the time to come and save the English against the Vikings. He also spent a year there as a young man, being heavily influenced by Catholic ideals, by Roman Catholic ideals. So he was considered as a Christian warrior king. And we had in 879 the treaty which allowed the Vikings to rule a sizable part of England. Part of that treaty actually included the idea that Guthrum converted to Christianity. So he helped his Viking, or what he saw as helping, he helped his Viking invaders by converting them to the laws of Christ, by converting them to Christianity and Christian values, so they would no longer be heathens or pagan. And actually, Alfred was even Guthrum's godfather at his baptism. And it wasn't just Guthrum that converted to Christianity, but also many of his closest advisors and closest warriors too. So with Alfred, he was spreading this English identity, which was so closely connected to Christianity, to Vikings, as well as English people across the country. So this cemented the primacy of Christianity in English identity, that it's an essential focus and it's really important. So one of the other things that he did was, in undoing the pillaging of the Vikings, is he built loads of churches and monasteries, and this one here is a picture of the Shaftesbury monastery that he had built, and it's a statue of him outside that monastery because of his close connections to it as well. Another claim then made in the inscription is the land ravaged by a fearful enemy from which he delivered it. So how did he ensure the survival of Anglo-Saxon rule? So you had one of the problems with the Vikings is that they were such good naval warriors. They had these terrific longboats which could go down could go down rivers quite easily, could cross the sea easily too. So in 896, Alfred, learning a lot from his time in Rome, used a lot of the studies from what the Greeks had achieved and helped to construct a small fleet of longships that had actually 60 oars, which was quite big. It's actually twice the size of Viking warships. So he commissioned this new fleet of longboats, which were larger than the Vikings, to defend England from invasions, because a lot of those invasions came from the sea. Also, we have in 937, Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, defeated the last of the Danes in the Battle of Brandenburg. So his grandson, was actually the first king of a united and unified England. So this was the combination of obviously Alfred setting this legacy and this idea that England should exist, that England shouldn't be this jigsaw of different identities and different kings and different rulers, but a place where you have one clear ruler, one clear king or queen of England. And he set across this idea, which his daughter and his son continued to do after his death. They continued to remove the Vikings out of England, and it was finally achieved by his grandson. And this would not have been possible without him laying those foundations really clear ones of English identity. And that identity is one where there is liberty with the power to create your own laws, as well as an identity based on education and Christianity. And he really ensured the survival of those basic ideas through his education system too. So one of the important themes of this course is looking at key individuals who have helped to shape Britain as it is today across migration and across empire too. So we will be building up a list of these figures over the course, but they can be quite difficult to remember when you're looking at 1,000 years of history. So in order to help you, we've created something called contact cards, and that's essentially where you're going to have these key bits of information about your different individuals, your key figures that you need to know. These key figures are highlighted as blue inside the textbook. There are also extra optional ones which are put forward as green, which can also help to support your answers. So what we've done is we've created these contact cards for you where you can have a summary of the individual, but also a consideration of how that individual impacts on the different themes within British history. So we have our key themes there, the 6 themes. And when we're thinking about Alfred, we can see there's a lot of themes that he ties into, although not necessarily all of them, but overwhelmingly, he definitely contributes to the formation of a British identity. So what you're going to do, unfortunately you don't have your contact card booklet with you because obviously we were put into lockdown, but you're going to just do this in your book for now, and when I give you your booklet, you'll transfer the information from your book into your booklet. So when we're thinking about King Alfred the Great, you're going to summarise key information about him into your book into your contact file. And what I want us to think about is which themes actually best connect to Alfred. So one is migration, survival, and also identity. He doesn't actually liberty too. He would fit into liberty as well, but not so much business and empire, because it has very little to do with business, because he's actually just trying to establish a country before he's looking at things like business. And in terms of empire, he's not even unified his country yet, so he doesn't have the ability to consider something like empire. So with migration, we're considering things such as he's stopping the further encroachment of Viking migrations. He's actually reducing the number of Viking migrations through creating instability under Viking rule. He's guaranteeing Anglo-Saxon survival against the Viking threat. That's reflected in the Battle of Edington, for example, but also in his creation of an English navy. Not the first English navy, but a very competitive English navy using all the skills that he had acquired whilst being in Rome. Also, you could talk about liberty, preserving English liberty through law, right? So the creation of English law and a liberty which is about protecting the liberty of all people within the country against the rich against the poor and the poor against the rich and so forth. But really this figure, this King Alfred the Great, is so important in shaping English identity. This is because he not only establishes the importance of Christianity and education for English identity, but he really lays the basis for the idea of England. And his creation of the idea of England is something that people generations after him continue to look back at something that they want to defend and something that they would like to protect. So what we need to consider then is, how far did the Danes unite the English? So was it the Vikings who had united the English, or was it actually the power of Alfred the Great? The Danes were essentially a really important factor in that they were a common enemy, an enemy which was worse than joining together. So was it the fact that, did Mercia join Alfred because they just didn't want to be ruled over by the Vikings, or did Alfred convince them to join because he had proven that he was a strong political leader who had united them through marriage and connected the two thrones, but also he had shown these brilliant ideas of scholarship, so learning, but also of Christianity too. So his construction of an English identity, and an English identity that was worth fighting for.